Back in October, DICE released the 5th chapter of Tides of War for Battlefield 5, centering around the war in the Pacific. With this update, we had gotten new weapons, vehicles, gadgets, and 2 new maps to play on. The first map focused on the Battle of Iwo Jima and was a more grim reimagining of the 1942-43 classic. The second map released for us was Pacific Storm, which is an entirely new map not previously included in either of those 2 games, and takes place during the US invasion of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. More specifically, this map takes place during the Battle of Kwajalein. Hey everyone, what's going on? Christopher the Video Game Historian here with another video on the real history behind the maps of Battlefield 5. Last week I took a look at the history behind the Arisaka rifle, and prior to that, the M1 Garand. And it's been a little while since I've had a real history of video based on the maps. That is why this week I am taking a look at the history behind the map Pacific Storm with the real history of the invasion of the Marshall Islands. Now, the invasion of the Marshall Islands was an important step in defeating the Japanese in the Pacific. Until this point, the American forces were losing a great deal of battles with almost no gain. In 1943, Admiral Chester Nimitz proposed to the Joint Chief of Staff an aggressive counteroffensive against the Japanese in a strategy known as island hopping. This strategy would allow the US forces to attack and capture certain islands while leaving the Japanese forces on the other islands to be isolated. The plan involved breaking through the defensive perimeter of the Marshall Islands, where they would then continue to the Philippines and eventually Japan. Since World War I, the Japanese had been in control of these islands due to a mandate in the Treaty of Versailles. While Japan would have control over the islands, they were also overseen by the League of Nations. When Japan left the League in 1933, they began converting the islands into military bases, and by World War II, they were Japan's outermost defensive perimeter of their Pacific assets, and a vitally important target for the US forces. However, before the Americans could officially attack the Marshall Islands, they first needed to attack and capture the Gilbert Islands in order to establish a military base closer from which they could effectively launch their attacks onto the Marshalls. In November of 1943, a small force of American Marines attacked the atoll of Tarawa that was being defended by about 5,000 Japanese soldiers. While the Americans were successful, it would set the tone for the rest of the battles in the Pacific. Now, while only 1,000 US troops were killed and 2,100 were injured or wounded, nearly all of 5,000 of the Japanese were killed as they refused to surrender, a theme that would play out in the rest of the battles in the Pacific throughout World War II. With the Gilberts now in the hands of the US military, the invasion of the Marshalls could officially begin. Initially, the plan called for the US to attack 3 of the island's atolls simultaneously, one of which was Kwajalein, with the goal of knocking out 2/3 of the Japanese forces, as well as neutralizing the airfields on the adjacent islets. By the end of the campaign, it was hoped that the US forces would also gain control over the Wake, Kusei, and Eniwetok atolls. However, the plan changed when Nimitz suggested bypassing 2 of the 3 original atolls, and simply focusing on Kwajalein. This would be Operation Flintlock, and was a joint operation between the Army and the Marines, with the 4th Marine Division, 22nd Regiment, and 7th Army Infantry Division assigned to the invasion, which was now set for January 31st, 1944. The day prior to the invasion, 85,000 Marines and Army soldiers made their way to the Marshall Islands. American planes flying out of the Gilberts were bombing the island's communication centers, as well as every airplane in the Japanese fleet that happened to be staged there. By February 1st, the 7th Infantry Division landed on Kwajalein, while the Marines landed on the islets of Roy and Namur, 45 miles north. By the end of the day, a single Marine regiment managed to capture Roy, while Namur would be taken by noon on the second day. The Battle of Kwajalein would be a little more difficult for the Army, as the Japanese were dug in deep, fighting to the last man standing. By February 4th, the island had been declared secured, with the Army losing less than 200 soldiers, with close to 5,000 Japanese defenders being killed. With the swift victory on Kwajalein, Nimitz advanced the planned attack on Eniwetok by 60 days. His plan to capture the atolls called for Marines to land on the islands of Engebe, Eniwetok, and Parry. This would now be the second half of this campaign, called Operation Catchpole. By February 17th, just a few short weeks after taking Kwajalein, Allied warships began to arrive off the coast of Engebe, bombing the island. The following day, the 1st and 2nd Battalions from the 22nd Marines began to land and began to encounter heavily dug-in Japanese defenders. Fighting from bushes and spider holes, the Japanese proved to be difficult to locate. However, with support from artillery battalions, the Marines were able to overwhelm them by the afternoon, taking out pockets of resistance by the next day. On February 19th, the push for Eniwetok began, with battalions from the 106th Infantry moving onto the beaches, only to encounter fierce resistance and a steep cliff that hampered not only their advance, but also the movement of vehicles. While pinned down by enemy fire and unable to advance, the 3rd Battalion of the 22nd Marines were ordered to land on Eniwetok as fast as possible. By the afternoon, the Marines had landed on the southern edge of the island, taking the full brunt of the Japanese resistance. By February 21st, the Marines had overtaken and secured the island of Eniwetok. The islet of Parry would fall the next day by 7:30 p.m. as the 1st and 2nd Battalions moved ashore behind a creeping barrage. With the capture of Parry, the Battle of Eniwetok came to an end, as did the Marshall Island campaign, with the Allies sustaining 348 men killed and 866 additional men wounded in the battle, while the Japanese lost an additional 3,400 soldiers. With both Kwajalein and Eniwetok secured, the US forces now had an easier time advancing through the rest of the Central Pacific campaign, with their sights set on Saipan, Guam, and eventually the Philippines. And that's really it for the history of the Marshall Islands campaign. While these battles were not all that long, there was a lot of backstory to go through to fully understand them. Hopefully though, you stuck around long enough and enjoyed the video, and if so, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. Also, let me know what your thoughts are on Pacific Storm, and what your favorite game modes are on it. As always, I'm the Video Game Historian, and until next time, I'll see you all on the battlefield.